right. Hello, Ambleside School. Miss Perry here. I am here today to share with you guys um, some of the work that goes into preparing for Passover. As you guys have heard already, this year our Passover chapel is going to look a little different. We'll be sharing a video with you guys in a few days. And we've also shared some resources so that anyone who's interested in following along with the video and having some of the Passover elements prepared and ready in their home can do so. But there's really actually a lot more that goes into preparing for Passover besides just making food and setting a table. And so today I'm going to talk to you guys about some of that and take you along on the journey. I thought I'd start with some scripture and then we'll just jump right in. So this comes from the book of Mark, chapter 14, verses 12 through 16. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" And so he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house as he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." And the disciples left, went into the city, and found the things just as Jesus had told them. And so they prepared for the Passover. The word of the Lord. Well, that passage doesn't give us a great deal of detail about what preparing for the Passover looked like, apart from you need to find a space to gather with your friends and family. But we do have other parts of Scripture that give us detail, as well as a great body of just tradition. So any Ambleside students who have seen a Passover chapel before know about the cherasset. Well, actually, before I talk about that, just a note to parents. Passover can be a little bit of extra work, but the good news is that none of that work is work that is designed for adults. The Passover is called the Children's Feast, and the labor of preparing for that children's feast was actually designed to be done by the small hands of children. And there's a really specific reason for that. The work itself of preparing for the Passover, much like a lot of the ritual of the Passover itself, is sort of silly and it's sort of unusual. And it's designed to prompt questions, the question why. And God did that very intentionally, so that when the children ask why do we do this silly work, why do we do these things, God's inviting parents to answer by recalling all of the mighty work of the Lord and his faithfulness to them. So as you watch me go through some of these rituals, remember that you don't have to do any of them. We're just inviting you kind of along on the journey. And if you do decide that these are things that your family would enjoy doing, really, I'd encourage you to take your hands off the wheel and hand this work over to your children. Sorry, there's a neighbor's car. There's going to be a few steps that involve cutting with knives and even a candle. You'll want to supervise those or allow your older children to supervise. But don't feel any pressure that you need to do these things yourselves, parents. Back to the cherasset. Any Ambleside students who have seen Mrs. Perry's Passover before know about the cherasset. It is a mixture of apples and nuts and honey that's ground into a coarse paste, and it's designed to remind us of the mortar that the Israelites were forced to grind in Egypt. But it's very sweet because the sweetness reminds us that God actually created work. He created man to work, and work is good. And so the hard work of grinding the apples and the nuts together reminds us of the unnecessary hard work of slavery. And for Christians, it reminds us of our own slavery today, our slavery to sin. But as you're sitting here mixing it, your fingers get sticky and you have honey on your hands and you might lick your fingers and you taste that sweetness and you remember that even in the garden, Adam and Eve worked and it was good. So I'm going to show you what it looks like to make cherasset in a sort of traditional way, and then I'm also going to show you some shortcuts you can take. So the main elements of cherasset are always apples, nuts, and honey. The nuts you can substitute. We use walnuts in our home because they're what we like, but pecans would work really well, or almonds. If you have allergies in your home, you can skip it altogether. You would need to peel the apple, core it, and dice it, which I've already done. And this is where the work that the young ladies of the house would do. You might see groups of girls sitting maybe on their doorstep of their home all together, cutting apples and chopping nuts and getting ready to grind the cherrisette. So I've cut my apples up into little cubes. I also went ahead and I cut up my walnuts into, again, just little cubes. The walnuts, the apples, and the honey are all you really need, but traditionally there's a few other things involved. Raisins or pitted dates are really good. I prefer dates, but we didn't have any in the house, and I'm not running to the store. Ground cinnamon, which you could grind by hand and really be reminded of the hard work that the Hebrew girls of Jesus' time that they would have put into preparing for the Passover. But I have, I'm actually going to be using nutmeg because we were also out of ground cinnamon. And then traditionally you could also add a splash of grape juice or wine if you're just preparing this for adults. So, young ladies, take note, and gentlemen too. What you'll need to do is you'll take your apples and go ahead and add them to your mortar and pestle. The mortar and pestle is really just the first century version of a food processor. And I'll tell you a secret. When we do this in my family, we often have all of our friends gathered for Passover. It can be up to 25 people. And sometimes when I have extra hands around to help me, I do it all by hand in the mortar and pestle, but sometimes I get out the food processor. And if you're going to do that in your home, you just want to be careful that you don't overgrind it. So apples and nuts and honey, and don't skimp on the honey because remember, work is good. At Ambleside, we fill our days with really joyful, beautiful work. And in the garden, when God first created man, before sin entered the world, Adam and Eve's days were filled with beautiful, joyful work. And so the honey and the sweetness of the honey reminds us of that. I'm going to add a few more nuts. If I was using dates, I would need to make sure that they were pitted and chopped up a little bit in advance, but I'm just going to use some raisins. And like I said, I don't have cinnamon in the house right now, so I'm using nutmeg. And on that document with the shopping list that we sent out, we included our recipe, but every family makes it differently. You could also add pomegranate seeds, would be delicious. Any other spices that your family enjoys. And then I'm going to add a little splash of grape juice to mine, but that's optional. And as I begin to grind, at first, my job is not too difficult. But when I've sat here in the past making enough cherrisette for 25 people, my arms get tired and my hands get sore. And I sit there and I start grumbling, Mom, can't I just use the food processor? Mom, why don't they sell this stuff at the store? Mom, why am I making this? This is such a weird thing to make. And all of those questions have an answer. And as I sit here and I grind the cherrisette, I'm reminded that I was never a slave. And I was never under the harsh taskmasters of the Egyptians. But then I'm also reminded of all those times when I knew what the right thing to do was, and I knew what I ought to do, and I wanted to do the right thing, but I just couldn't. And then I even think of the times when I knew what the right thing was, and I just didn't want to do it, and I on purpose chose to do the wrong thing. And I ask myself, what is that? Why do I do that? Why don't I do the things I know I ought to do? And I'm reminded that as much as I love Jesus, I'm still a slave to sin. And I remind myself of the words of the Apostle Paul when he said that I've left undone the things that I wished to do while doing the things that I hated. And I remember that Jesus called himself the Passover Lamb because he came to die for my sins. Because just like the Hebrew people couldn't save themselves from the slavery of the Egyptians, so too I am powerless to free myself from my slavery to sin. And as you can see, my hands are getting sticky. I'm making a mess. That's why I'm doing this outside. When I was a little girl, my sister, Mrs. Anderson, and I used to sit outside and do this together. And as we got a little bigger, we used to invite the neighbors to join us at Passover. And so their kids would come over in the morning, and we would sit outside together and grind the cheriset. And we would work together. One of us would chop the apples and peel them, and one of us might chop up the walnuts and the dates. And then if we had 2 mortars, we'd have 2 people grinding. And we would laugh and argue about, oh, that's too much cinnamon, or you didn't put enough nuts in there, or I don't like it with the grape juice, I want it a different way. And it's just a joyful time and a reminder of why God created this feast. So the cheriset just needs to be ground until it's a little bit mushy, but still kind of chunky. We like it kind of chunky in our house. But again, whatever sounds good to you. So that's one of the major elements of preparing for the Passover, and that's one of the things that in Jesus' time would have occupied young boys and girls for the whole day leading up to Passover. Mom would be in the house roasting the lamb, setting the table, getting everything ready in case Grandma and Grandpa were coming to celebrate Passover with them, and the kids would be outside grinding the cheriset and asking why and telling the story of the Exodus. So I'm going to set this aside. We're going to call that good enough. Another one of the jobs that would have needed to happen when Jesus sent his disciples into Jerusalem to find a place to prepare for the Passover was that you couldn't celebrate Passover until you knew that there was no more leaven in your house. Leaven means bread or food that has been risen to make it fluffy and nice. And you can't have that in your house during Passover, because remember that on the night of the Exodus from Egypt, they had to leave so quickly that they didn't have time to make their bread dough and let it rise. Instead, they just had to quickly pat out their dough, stick it in the oven, and cook it flat. And so now, even a couple hundred years later, when Jesus was celebrating the Passover in Jerusalem, every Jewish house they'd go through the whole house and find all of the leaven, and they'd get rid of it. And you have to think hard, because there's leaven hiding in some things you might not even think about. Bread is the big one, but those cookies that you like because they're soft and fluffy, those have leaven in them. Those pancakes that maybe you saved from breakfast on Saturday, those have leaven in them. Your saltine crackers might, I don't know. So one of the jobs that would maybe belong to the boys of the house would be to go through the whole home and collect all of the leaven and destroy it. Now, we don't like to waste food in our family, and we know that because of Christ we're freed from the law, and we're not super worried about getting rid of all the leaven. But we still find it as a family an enjoyable practice to just go through the house and find all of it. And then what we like to do is just put it in a basket, and we put that basket out on the porch. And then after Passover is over, we can bring it back in and not waste any. But if we want to be really traditional and authentic, what you would need to do is you'd go find all of the leaven in your home, you'd throw it away, get rid of it, it can't be in your house, and then, even then, you're not done. Because little boys and girls, then Mom or Grandma would give you a feather, and she'd say, go into the corners of the pantry, sweep out the corners, find all the little bits of leaven. Go into the kitchen, you need to sweep all the counters, make them clean, get all the little bits of leaven out of the house. Go to the door frame, get all of the leaven out of the house. It's got to all be gone. But anyone who's ever been in the kitchen knows that it's never truly clean. There's always a crumb left somewhere. And so after you got rid of all the leaven you could possibly find, and after you've swept it all out with a feather, someone in the house, maybe the mom, maybe the oldest sibling, would take a candle. And parents, if this is something you choose to practice, you'll want to supervise. You're going to light your candle. And then we take a little bit of that leaven that we found, and they would say a prayer saying, "Oh Lord, if there is any leaven remaining in this home, may it be like this remnant." And they would pass it through the flame to symbolically destroy it. And we say that prayer for God's mercy and God's grace. So Lord, you gave us this commandment to get rid of the leaven from our homes. We know we can't obey perfectly, and so I'm making a sacrifice or just a gesture to say, Lord, forgive my imperfectness as I get rid of the leaven. So those are two of the things that we like to do in our family to prepare for the Passover. They can be as big a job as you want them to be, or they can just be a little gesture that you do. If you'd like to get out your food processor to help you with making the chericet, or maybe if you just want to go sweep out your pantry real quick with a feather, you can. But as you prepare for the chapel video that's going up in a few days, I'd encourage you to consider inviting your children to practice some of these rituals and invite them to ask why, because this is the children's feast. It's a little bit of a silly time. We're making these snacks that are unlike anything we eat during the rest of the year. We're doing these cleaning things that we don't really worry about on other days, and we have to ask why. Well, anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you're inspired to bring some of these practices into your own home.